Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Thank you so much for allowing me into your busy podcast feeds and for taking the time to listen to this podcast. But remember, this is not my podcast. I always like to say it's our podcast, and each and every one of you are welcome to join me on here. So please keep your emails, DMs and insights coming over to me at techblogwriter@outlook.com. Now, if we look back last year to 2020, it will be remembered for many things, but especially it will be remembered as the year that brought massive disruption from COVID-19. And the abrupt shift to a remote workforce in March last year has been accused of creating holes in the cybersecurity landscape for malicious actors to exploit. And amid the pandemic, the harrowing spike in cyberattacks towards the government, hospitals, education, institutions, and even security firms all forced enterprises, both large and small, to take a closer look at potential vulnerabilities, starting at the API level. And every business leader will tell you that this is the age of the API, so those words might be particularly worrisome for some. So today I invited the cybersecurity veteran Jasen Meece from Cloudentity on the podcast today to talk about how he sees the landscape right now and also explore some of his predictions on the road ahead. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Phoenix, Arizona, where Jasen is waiting to speak with us right now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Jasen Meece here, CEO of Cloudentity.
Before we started recording the podcast, we were talking about our own experiences with COVID-19. And one of the questions I was going to ask you to begin with is, do you think that COVID-19 and the shift to remote work have actually accelerated ZeroTrust adoption in the enterprise?
Yeah, Neil, that's a great question. If you think about the pandemic as an accelerant more so than a change agent, right? Yeah. We've had a lot of these enabling technologies in place. And we knew that kind of shift to cloud, that boat had proverbially left the harbor and it wasn't going back in, but it also wasn't leaving the harbor at full speed, right? Now we're making a wake out. And so what's happened is the pandemic thrust everyone into a fully remote capacity. And, for those of us in tech, we've been in and out of this space for quite some time. I started my career way back at Sun Microsystems where, we were playing with some of the stuff with dial-up modems and it was kind of a horrific experience. But, now as we kind of thrust it upon everyone, we realized that we had pieces there, but not for everyone to scale out. And so it really put a thrust there. It brings back, one of our clients had an issue where they were on a migration path from being on-prem to hybrid cloud and trying to get to multi-cloud. But then when the city of Seattle locked down, they couldn't actually get their employees into the data center. They couldn't actually get to work. And so they realized, hey, we've got to change the paradigm here. And what that meant is everything became perimeterless. And so ZeroTrust, instead of a punchline for a joke or just a philosophy to try to strive towards, became a reality. We had to actually assume that the network was now porous. There was no known perimeter, the moat and castles we used to call it. And everyone now is a remote individual, even if they have high access, system level access. And so then we had to say, how do we enforce these policies at the very edge of the service and device to make sure we can not just do our work, but also grow our business? And so absolutely, as an accelerant, and there's different adages out there, anywhere between 2 to 10 years. I put it about 3 to 5, that digital transformation experience has been accelerated due to the pandemic.
And another thing I think today is that we're interacting with bots more than ever before, whether it's a customer service chatbot or AI on our devices and things like Siri and Alexa, etc. So what do you think the rise of machine identity for AI bots means for businesses? Because it's such a hot topic right now, isn't it?
It is, Neil. Yeah, when we think about it, so central to where Cloudentity fits, we're all about making sure the right users have access to the right data at the right time. And historically that had much more of a workforce, workflow kind of standpoint, and users were carbon-based life forms. Now what we're seeing is, IoT is still there and it's on an uptick, but where the big rise has been in machine identity, system to system accounts, and or interaction with AI. Case in point, I did a return on a very large platform for e-commerce here that everyone pretty much knows what it is, but I won't be overly egregious with the plugs. And basically the entire return cycle happened with a bot. And then effectively, because it was below a threshold, they didn't even ask for me to return the item. I just kept it. So I got my money back, kept it. And so as these things start to happen, it has a material impact on both the business and making sure you automate. But conversely, this stuff can go rogue and go wrong. And so when you look at how we kind of thrust ourselves into this change where everything's now access is poor, as much as the zero trust comment, if we can't secure those machine identities, and if we can't secure every single transaction all the way down to the API layer, we're actually opening ourselves up for a fair amount of risk, because bots can be used for good, but bots can also be used for bad. And we've seen that, specifically with ticket scalping, where someone will kind of rush in and we got the caps and stuff here, to try to make sure it's a human. But as more and more of this happens, it's incumbent to make sure that you can really enforce the policy or the rules, be they either for growth, know your customer, and or regulation, some type of constraint to mitigate against a risk, all the way down to the API layer. Otherwise, we're opening ourselves up for a significant amount of risk going forward.
Absolutely. And of course, over here in the UK and Europe, we have GDPR, and over in the US, CPRA passed. I think it was in November last year, and it's expected that many other states and countries may follow suit in implementing further data and privacy laws to give consumers control of how their personal data is being used. So can you tell me more about why data regulations like CPRA and GDPR must be enforced at the API level?
Yeah, it's another great question. So it goes back, and this is a quote that I actually have to attribute to the former CEO of Sun Microsystems, Scott McNealy, that said many moons ago when I was working there, that if you're not paying for the service, you are the product, which basically means if someone's giving you free email and a free interface to do stuff, somehow they're monetizing that. And, the other adage is data's become the new oil. It can also become the new CO2 if you don't treat it properly. And so what we found is this concept of data lineage or consent, the users really should have control about who's accessing their data and what they're doing with it. And for a long time, we really weren't as mindful of this because most of the apps using it were more kind of a B2C space, but now they're becoming financial service transactions. Open banking, specifically the UK, has done a great job at leading that charge. PSD2 in Europe, coupled with GDPR, folks want to know who's touched my data, who's accessed it, and what are they doing with it. And the way that we historically did this was to do some type of either screen scraping or what's known as credential stuffing, where I log into one account that then would give access to everything else. The problem is I just gave access to everything. And, case in point, I may want, one financial services or fintech app to access a bit of data. And maybe I just want them to do a post of what my account is so I can qualify for a mortgage or a credit line. What they don't need to know is all my investments, my car loan, my credit card balance, and all that other stuff. And so that idea of consent flow and progressive consent, where the consumer can control who's accessing their data and then have the ability to both grant that access and take it away. If it's not done at the API level, and if there's not what we refer to as the authorization control plane, or what someone authorizes someone to do, then you actually cannot enforce it. And so I think we're at the beginning of this trend where folks more and more realize that they become productized and they want to start to get their head and their hand around it.
And something I am hearing more and more about is open banking. And I'm conscious we will have some people listening that will know all about it and others will maybe a little bit unsure. So can I ask that you just set the scene and just explain that concept of open banking for the listeners?
Yeah, open banking is a great use case of this concept of dynamic authorization. Again, kind of thing. You could apply this exact same flow or thought to healthcare information, to utility kind of open data. But the reason open banking is a great example is, we've got 3 generations alive right now that all have a very different view on what happens. If you look at my parents, everything was pushed to them. If it wasn't in the newspaper on, one of 5 or 6 channels on the TV, then they couldn't actually get the information, right? It was very difficult. My generation's a little bit of push and pull, and my children, Generation Z, are all just pull. And so what's happening is, open banking is both a regulatory issue. And if you look at how Europe's handling it, it's tied tighter to GDPR. Quite frankly, Europe got ahead of the States in this regard. In the US, there's a program called FDX, which is more of a, how do we monetize the situation? They meet in the middle. So it ends the same, but it's 2 different vantage points as to how you get there. And what open banking really does is it democratizes the ability for folks to get financial information, right? There's a whole bunch of people who are unbanked. You can think of a lot of third world countries where they maybe don't have access to a proper banking system. And with that, it limits the progress of humanity if they can't. And open banking specifically says, hey, I, the user, can control one of two things: who can see some of my financial information and who can move that money around. It's really just two aspects there. You can see what I have and or I can move it around. And what it allows you to do is to do that securely through a platform that allows the user to, again, give consent to different organizations to either look at a balance and or move money. And I'm in control. And it also allows emerging companies that ordinarily would have been blocked out from, say, a large financial institution, the ability to get in and participate and pretty much overall benefit the societies with which they're pushing this topic.
And I'm curious, why do you think open banking market growth has accelerated in the last few years? Because it really does seem to be going at quite a pace right now, doesn't it?
It totally is. And going back to, our initial comment with the pandemic as an accelerant, I'll use my kiddos as an example. They have no intention in going into a proper bank branch. They just don't want to do it. They just literally don't. And when we bring them there to go save box or something, they almost cringe like they have to do this thing. But they will move all kinds of micro amounts of money around to go meet at Starbucks or go to a movie, or when they used to go to a movie, I guess now rent one, for the, $5 to $10, £5 to £10 kind of thing. And they don't want to do that with a traditional bank. They want to do it with all kinds of cool apps. It could be Venmo, SoFi. There's a whole host of them out there. And by pretty much being able to abstract that payment layer out and doing it with an interface, specifically smartphones, also a big component here, and there's a whole lot of reasons it's been helpful, it allows them to do just that. And so now what we're seeing is there's been a groundswell of that activity. Also, even if I look at my folks, before they would not on some type of Venmo app order something to be delivered outside of their door and or picked up at the curb of a restaurant, whereas now they are, and they had to from the pandemic. And so I think back to that change agent, it's accelerated a lot of the functionality that was already there. And, this ship is not going back into the harbor. It's going to continue to accelerate.
And that feels like a great moment to introduce what you're doing at Cloudentity there. So is there anything you can share about the kind of work that you're doing in open banking and open healthcare, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, going back to what our central tenet is, making sure the right users have access to the right data at the right time. You can also think about this example as a tip to tail. So there's this concept of authentication out there, and folks would sometimes call this single sign-on. It's kind of the front door. You have to open up and get something in. And then there's always been these concepts of API management, API gateways that can do some of the enforcement in what's also known as a fine-grained level at the very edge. But what's been missing is a risk engine that can make sure that this happens and gives data lineage across all those different steps. And so Cloudentity is that risk engine. So what we do is we connect the authentication piece, kind of authentication plus, and where we really focus in is authorization. This is that fine-grained piece, very detailed. And what's happened is, before it was either a monolithic application inside of an on-prem app or all in the cloud, but now we're finding it's everything in between. And so as organizations try to scale that out, they have to look at the architecture differently. And specifically, without getting too technical, we can do this policy enforcement, the very edge of the service inside of a container. And so now if you can secure it at the very kind of edge of the service, you gain a level of visibility, but you also, more importantly, gain a level of protection and enforcement. So now you can come back and say, yes, we are GDPR compliant. Here's the audit log to prove it. By the way, customer, here's what you consented to. We can show you when you did, when you turned it off, and what happened with that data flow or that data lineage. And that visibility is something that's equally important to both the consumers as well as the corporations out there.
And before you came on the podcast today, I was doing a little research on you and Cloudentity, and you've already mentioned it today, but I did read about your thoughts on Gen Z and how it's leading this shift to open banking. So with that in mind, can you share with the listeners why you think it will ultimately lead to an influx of software companies being founded, all with the purpose of creating a new method for digital-first consumers to do banking? Because it just feels like everything's being everything's topsy-turvy right now, and the world is changing at such a speed, isn't it?
It really is, right? And so again, it goes back, before, and we'll shift a little bit to a different industry to make another example that hits home with folks. If you went to the, basically the healthcare system in the UK, US, or any countries for that fact, you'd go to a centralized authority that had your patient records. Sometimes they would have you sign a piece of paper. They give you a packet or some x-rays, and you'd walk over to the next doc to do something else and show them your x-rays. Well, that isn't efficient. It doesn't work. And so as we start to open that up, we now are taking it even a step further with telemedicine. Again, with the pandemic as a backdrop, we're now moving patient data that's highly sensitive. It's immutable in that, if I have a broken leg, I'll always have had a broken leg, and those records are there to prove that I am who I am. And so as we start to move to where everything's being shared, we have to do it in a way that's secure. And so from the Gen Z standpoint, right, they just expect this to be on demand, and they pull it whenever they want. And so to stay ahead of it and make sure that they go to the right healthcare provider, be it an urgent care center or a doc for a quick checkup if they have a cough, all the way through they need to schedule some type of more invasive procedure, they expect to do that on a mobile device. Generally a phone, could be an iPad or for God forbid, a laptop or email, which is now becoming a dinosaur according to my daughters. So I've already made dinosaur status. So with that, when you're pushing all these different devices, if you can't secure it and again show that data lineage, you've got all kinds of compliancy issues. But more importantly, you also run the risk of sending the wrong thing to the wrong people. There was a recent one here in the States where a healthcare system didn't really secure it properly and opened up all the prescription data to the wrong patients. And so it can have a very adverse effect. If I thought I was going in to get, nitroglycerin or something for a heart condition, and I ended up with some other medicine that was just a placebo. And so this actually starts to matter. And so as we kind of open that up, and again, with ZeroTrust as a backdrop from a concept as well as enabling technologies, this has to happen at scale, has to happen across multiple platforms. And the only way to do that is to enforce it at the very edge of the API, which is kind of the central tenet of Cloudentiy.
And I'm glad you mentioned telemedicine there, because a Fortune CEO survey recently showed, I think it was 77% of CEOs reported that the COVID-19 crisis accelerated their digital transformation plans, and that 40% are spending more on IT infrastructure and cloud platforms. So presumably, from what you've been telling me here, the exact same thing happens for the healthcare industry as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we push all this stuff out, there's two aspects. It's easy to talk about, what in cyber we'd always refer to as FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And here's the big bad compliance. You have to attest all those things. And there's a reason for that. But no one woke up one day and said, I want more cyber. I want more regulations. They're there because something went wrong and the guardrails had to be put in place. But because this digital transformation is accelerated so greatly, a lot of what the CEOs are actually signaling is, which is, as one, I'm always mindful of how are we growing the company? Are we ahead of it? Not just what have we mitigated from a risk standpoint? It matters, but it brakes around a car so you can go faster. And so the investment in technology is to how can I deliver a better experience to my end customers that's virtual and in the method and mode that they're looking for, where they can get value, but also do it in a secure way. And so as that happens, case in point, I also had COVID, would never have gone to a teledoc probably before the pandemic, but then all of a sudden it became a necessity and wanted to make sure that my O2 levels were in the right range. And so, fired one up. But with that became a whole lot of shared information, again, like we were just talking about. And so I think we'll see this anywhere consumer data at scale is starting to happen. You can pretty much just go down the line, and we'll start to also see this in large retail and everything else after this. And so this data democratization environment that we're in is only going to start speeding up.
And before I started writing and recording podcasts every day, I was an IT guy working specifically in the world of applications. So I know all about the battles that go with those legacy applications. And Cloudentity is a provider of dynamic authorization solutions for enterprises. So with that in mind, bearing in mind, I still get flashbacks from those days and horror stories.
Likewise.
Can you tell me more about how you're attempting to modernize and integrate those legacy applications and cloud services?
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of it, so the adage that's changed is we used to go in and take the approach of rip and replace. Something was wrong, we'll put something new and it'll do a better job, faster, better, faster, cheaper, the old adage in tech. Now it's really enhance and expand or augment and expand. And that's really where Cloudentity fits. So we've taken a microservices architecture approach, which basically means we're small building blocks. The relevance is there. We can get it into the marketplace faster, so it's a quicker time to value. So that's always good. We can do it less expensively or invasively, in that you can start to leave some of your legacy applications that are on-prem back there as an orchestration and automation engine, front end it with our microservices so it looks very cloud native. And then you can pragmatically decompose those monolithic apps, which is a lot of fancy words of saying in a rational way, take the old stuff down, as opposed to saying, hey, we've got to make this other big sea change and rip all this stuff out, like the old ERP, implementations from back in the day that was horrific and lots of money spent and a lot of, frustrated folks. But what it all boils down to is getting that service, application, access, software out into the wild faster and securely. Because what we're also starting to see is to do this idea of policy enforcement, which is kind of the what are the rules for zero trust at the very edge or API level, you now need to abstract out the authorization, kind of those control points from the application. Otherwise, every time you write a new app, you have to keep revving it, and that's also inefficient. So as we move to a more cloud native elastic approach, so we can scale our apps, this is what's known as CI/CD pipeline or architecture approach that folks are using to be more efficient in the new world.
Fantastic. And given everything that we've discussed today, and we have covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, what is your primary focus this year and beyond? Is there anything you can share about the road ahead?
Yeah, it's really honing in on a couple of things. One is continue to help our clients with their cloud adoption and acceleration so they can decompose those legacy apps. There's efficiencies to be had there, and we're very mindful of that. And then also really doubling down on, almost open banking 2.0 in the UK, right? The first wave has come and gone. We know what we need to do to be more efficient. And so we're being very mindful with that as the use case. But the big backdrop is starting to put in place both the rules. So think of it almost as, what we would call policy packs or the guideposts that an organization would have to enforce zero trust at the very edge of the API. Because once folks really embody zero trust as a lifestyle choice, not as the punchline to a joke or a bunch of slides in a PowerPoint, then what they realize is we're really saying, hey, listen, we're going to make everyone vet themselves all the way through the transaction so it's secure as possible. And from that, we're going to gain a lot of information. And there's now enabling technologies and, more importantly, rules and controls out there for organizations to work within. And so, our central tenet is zero trust. This is kind of the year of zero trust, and open banking is one instantiation of it. We could go on and on with other industries.
Well, I've loved chatting with you today. I'm conscious we've only scratched the surface and we could have chatted for hours. And
exactly.
For anybody listening that would like to dive a little bit deeper into the subject today and carry on this conversation we started, what's the best way to find Cloudentity online and equally contact your team if they do have any questions?
Absolutely. 3 ways. One is, Cloudentity, and it's just CLOUDENTITY.com. Conversely, you can also send an email to info@cloudentity.com or specifically Meece, JMEECE @cloudentity.com, and be happy to make sure we get across any questions that your customers might have.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, I love chatting with you. I loved exploring the landscape right now, obtaining a better understanding of what's happening out there and the trends, and also exploring some of your predictions for the road ahead. I feel we're going to have you back on towards the end of the year and see how those predictions are heading and look at life in 2022 too. But more than anything, just thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Neil. And we'd love to come back and unpack how the year progressed for us. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
So many great points there and a lot of food for thought. And I should highlight that Cloudentity does bring an unparalleled combination of identity and distributed enforcement to cloud hybrid APIs and applications that drive further collaboration. And it's that kind of advanced architecture that helps create a seamless integration of authorization with security policy management that allows companies to visualize their security in the context of real-world threats. All, most importantly, while creating a full audit trail of policy enforcements that can provide compliance in an increasingly complex world of legal compliance. But this is a subject that's going to affect every single business in every industry, no matter what size that they are. So if you're a business leader or working in a tech team, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your observations, and any insights that you can share on anything that we talked about today. So for that, I'm going to open up my inbox once again and say, email me techblogwriter@outlook.com or pop by my website, techblogwriter.co.uk. Let me know what you've been seeing out there, what trends you're seeing, and what you're putting in place to counteract some of those threats. I'm interested in what you're all going to come back at me with, but no matter what, I will be here waiting deep inside your podcast feeds like a bad spell, pleading with you to hit play. So hopefully you'll join me again tomorrow. But more than anything, just a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.